Alex Merose, member of the technical staff of Open Athena. It's a huge privilege to have you on the Geospatial FM podcast to talk about weather foundation models.
Hey, the privilege is all mine. Thanks, Will, for having me on.
All right, so as is often the case in me hosting these episodes, I am playing the advocate of the lay audience. I'm going to be here trying to ask the questions to keep everybody understanding this technical expert that we have in you in front of us, Alex. So yeah, excited for your presentation.
Excited to be here. I'll explain more of my background, but these are my thoughts on foundation weather models, also known as AI weather models or machine learned weather models. From my experience building them over several years. I think weather is maybe related to, and not totally, it's overlapping, but not totally related to the geospatial world. But I think it's growing in importance when you see like data formats like XAR kind of leaking over from weather into geospatial, first from biology.
I can see that cool. I love the back of my phone, this disaster.
That's cool. Okay, so yeah, I feel like I definitely, these are my people, and I'm happy to be here.
Fantastic. All right. Would it be an idea to spend 30 seconds on what Open Athena is before you dig in?
That is a great idea, and I really should have planned that. So it's really interesting. This is a podcast on the world of geospatial stocks. So naturally, I come on working for a nonprofit, but there's no stock.
Happy to have you here.
Yeah. So Open Athena is an AI foundation. It's a nonprofit, and we're kind of like an AI lab or really a nonprofit that focuses on being a good accompaniment to academia. And we're trying to help frontier scientific labs and academia build foundation models, foundation machine learning models in various domains of science. So I happen to work in the climate and weather space, but my coworkers work in wide ranges of science, from like biology to materials and chemistry and things like that. Kind of the idea or the thesis of Open Athena is that there's like a missing piece where academia has really deep domain expertise in like really some of the world's best data sets, and they often have lots of compute available to build large scale machine learning models. But there's like a industrial skill gap that the kind of skills from industry hasn't fit well into the incentive structure of academia. And Open Athena, this nonprofit, is trying to fill that gap and like help academia compete more or less with hyperscaler AI labs.
Yeah, so there's still some connections that can be made to the nature of this podcast, because the best companies are often a commercialization of cutting edge ideas that come out of efforts like yours or out of academia. So I'm sure there's plenty of listeners that are still very, very curious about what you have to say. Another link is that, because you're ex-Google, right?
I used to work at Google, that's right.
Yeah. So another guest in this foundation model space that we've had was Sergey Nozdrenkov, I believe his surname was. He is the founder of Wildflow.ai, which is a foundation model effort focused on the world's coral reefs. So some of the colleagues you mentioned there sounds like there's connected work.
That's cool. Yeah. I'm really interested in coral reefs. It overlaps a bunch of my work on like the biological side, which I'll explain in a second. But yeah, I think this still definitely is really a good fitting. I think there's like one of the beautiful things I love about the U.S. model is with public investment generally into basic research at the university, it often leads to huge advancements in the private sector. And the fundamental technical risk and the fundamental product risks are two of the big bottlenecks to bring an idea to life. And you need a healthy balance of both in order to produce massive amounts of innovation. And I'm happy to be working closer to the basic research side with Open Athena.
Awesome. All right. Well, yeah, I can't wait to step through the slides here and see the concepts you put before us.
Okay. Well, this is just one moment. Here's my little pointer. So a little bit about me, like Will mentioned, I used to work on weather models at Google Research. Also, independent of that, or meanwhile, I've been a contributor to Pangeo.io. It's a open source community or like collective for big data geoscience. I think a lot of the stickers on the back of your phone you just demonstrated are often, products or contributions of that community, which is really exciting. I work at Open Athena. I'm affiliated with M Squared Lines, which is like a multi-university collaboration focused on multi-scale physics. And I currently work in collaboration with MIT and NYU, or who Open Athena is partnering with for this particular this research effort. And I work on physical ocean models, so trying to study the physical ocean. So your friend who works on coral reefs, I think that might be more towards like the biochemical side. But still, it definitely is an area of my interest. And Will, I know you are a big traveler and you've had a lot of experience internationally. That's something that'd be fun to talk about. Before I started working at this job, I traveled the world for a year between working at Google and working here. And some of my background, I have my Google Scholar screenshot right here. These are some papers that I contributed to while working on weather models at Google Research. MetNet3, WeatherBench 2, and GraphCast, which are important contributions to the weather AI community.
And I see you've achieved 1,000+ citations there for one. That is a couple of orders of magnitude more than my single Google Scholar peer-reviewed publication. So,
GraphCast, I am really happy to be on that paper. It was really nice of I think Peter Battaglia to include me. I contributed primarily in the data engineering and data work for producing the data sets that enabled DeepMind to make their groundbreaking model.
Okay, you're tackling several of the themes that this podcast is about, because there's also an emphasis on data engineering and a connection also to a guest from 2 episodes ago who talked about data engineering in the context of Microsoft Fabric. So, okay, yeah.
I'm so excited to get to one of my slides. I feel like in particular you're going to like it per the themes you mentioned about this podcast. And anyway, this is kind of a high-level outline of what I'm going to be talking about. I'm going to talk about what is the status quo before ML weather models? Like, how does numerical weather prediction work, and kind of what is its history? I'll talk about ML weather models in its very more recent history and kind of what's going on in the state of the art. And then I want to maybe take a 10,000-foot view and step back. The transition from 1 to 2, what does it really mean? And can we rethink these like systems and computing altogether with the advent of this new technology? So first I want to talk about NWP, or numerical weather prediction. First, the kind of recipe for numerical weather prediction goes back to the 1920s, maybe even a little bit earlier, with Lewis Richardson. He wrote a seminal book, Weather Prediction by Numerical Process, that is more or less, even though we have supercomputers that can only be run by governments, it more or less is the same idea that we had, developed over, let's say, the First World War, which is the idea that Richard envisioned, like in the turn of the 20th century, in like leading up to the 20s, there was this big kind of what was going on at the time is Taylorism, like the birth of the factory model, making things more efficient. So like naturally, when Lewis Richardson imagined how we might create a weather forecast, he imagined it as a factory, just kind of like the water in which everyone swam at the time. And to produce the numerical calculations, which is where computers were people who were doing small bits of calculus on paper, he imagined having a really great circular room that would mimic the globe, and having 64,000 people writing, passing paper in between each other in like a network, and running their computation and passing it on. And there'd be a big conductor showing highlighting what needed more attention in the center. And that would go, there'd be enough people doing computation that would be fast enough to do, to make a forecast in a short amount of time.
This is like a data observatory room or emergency ops center from 100 years ago.
Totally, yeah. It kind of reminds me of like, maybe in medical or hospitals, there's like rooms of people observing lots of patients or whatever. I don't know. I think there may be a lot of interesting windows into what this was. Just to give a shout out, George Dyson just gave a talk at a Radiant Earth Summit on the history of numerical weather prediction and kind of like climate and all the stuff that I think is one of the most exciting talks that I've witnessed, as being like a super nerd in the space. But I have a link right here on YouTube that I recommend people watch. This is a picture of this weather prediction by numerical processes from George Dyson.
Is he holding a light there and shining it on the ceiling?
I think, yes, he is. He's basically saying that it looks like, Canada like the northern regions of Canada need more attention to like calculated sum or something like that.
Amazing. I love the concept.
So I'll fast forward, like instead of 64,000 people, what ended up doing that work were computers made of transistors and rooms of networked computers. And there's a lot really interesting history about how the computer itself, like the von Neumann architecture, actually was built around trying to solve meteorological computation. But I'll leave that for a story for George Dyson to tell. But more or less, I'd like to talk about kind of the recipe of how numerical weather prediction work. Like, how is it we are able to produce a forecast and tell you, in the next 3 days, whether it's going to rain or how hot it will be. So kind of the given state of the world is that we can't observe everything about every part of the world or every part of the atmosphere all at once. While we have satellites, they usually are like, I imagine them as like a flashlight on a map. They get like sparse recordings of the surface of the Earth, and then we have lots of MET stations all throughout the world, but not everywhere and not evenly distributed. And we have lots of other indirect sensors like weather balloons and all these things. So the setting we have for the start of the problem is sparse observation. It's the process of something called analysis to use physics and use a physical model to interpolate or extrapolate where we go from sparse observations of the world to cover every point on the surface of the Earth and the atmosphere. And that process is called an analysis. So an analysis, you have to create a kind of a notion of a grid, which is a way of representing the entire surface, the entire space of the atmosphere as an array, more or less, that you go from an observation. This is produced by a physics-based model that tries to get what the current state of the Earth is.
And is this a volumetric grid? So we're talking about cubes here?
It is like a large data cube, but usually it's actually, there's a lot of controversial choice in the structure, whether it's like a rectilinear grid is one interpretation or choice. It's just useful to do retrieval program against that model. But that has a huge problem of like introducing error, because if you evenly space points on a sphere, you're going to have a bad time with the poles being really distorted.
Okay. All right. So as soon as you start asking questions, there's a huge amount of controversy at every step of the way, it sounds.
Totally. I'm happy to take every detour,
Okay. Should we say, for the benefit of those who are listening on a podcast, what Alex has got here is a diagram where you're starting with the observation step on the left, and he's cycling around with analysis at the top of the diagram. I won't interrupt anyone.
So my diagram, for those with a mind's eye that can imagine at home, imagine like a flow chart where you start at observations, you go to analysis, then analysis produces a forecast, and then you have another effect where a forecast and observations feed both into each other to produce something called a reanalysis, which I'll explain in a second. And a reanalysis and analysis, they kind of reinforce each other. They both feed into each other, and I'll explain this. So once you've gone from sparse observations into a like 3D, 4D, because it's through time, representation of what is going on everywhere on the Earth, of what's happening right now, you can then extrapolate forward in time. And usually that's a process where you have a perfect like physical model, like, these are like the Navier-Stokes equations to create a circulation model or a general circulation model, and you can step forwards in time to extrapolate like in 3 days or like 2 weeks time, what is the temperature and humidity and maybe precipitation going to be in this in anywhere or everywhere along the globe.
Is it just those three things: temperature, humidity, precipitation? Those are the outcomes of these analyses?
That's a good question.
That's what in these forecasts.
They're usually like tens to like maybe around 50 or 100 independent variables that are being predicted. So when you're talking about these in terms of data cubes, usually you're talking about 4 orthogonal axes, like latitude, longitude, level, like pressure level, vertical distance in the atmosphere, time, the 4th orthogonal axis, and then for each color channel of the cell, if you're imagining an image, there might be like 50 color channels or 50 data variables per that cell. And those that are familiar with X-ray, this will seem really natural primarily because
so just to say to people, X-ray is a file type, and we were making the joke that yes, that is one of the logos on the back of my phone. That's about along with
X-ray is a data frame library. And it takes its inspiration from a data format called netcdf. X-ray is kind of like an in-memory, the in-memory Python version of a netcdf protocol. And there's a really great talk by Deepak Charan on like the history of these data standards. But the data format itself comes from trying to represent this data in this community and trying to create this analysis or like global grid of an Earth system.
Okay, so I guess to try to show that I'm keeping up with you somehow, you mentioned that these forecasts are made at a location in a 2D sense. So you've got latitude and longitude for where it is on the planet where this forecast is being made. Then you mentioned level. So that's the elevation from the Earth's surface up into, I guess, the edge of the atmosphere. So that forecast will be made at some altitude. Is that right?
Yeah, so there's, I think I've seen often forecasts being separated from the surface, which usually is like at the ground or like, 3 meters above the ground, like 10 feet, because that's like roughly consistent, amount of like heat or other meteorological properties. And then usually going like, via pressure level. So pressure, I think, varies exponentially going up from the surface of the Earth. So usually the levels, the numbers themselves seem like really far apart from each other, but that's because pressure, exponentially decreases as you go up to the highest levels of the atmosphere. So, from our like chemistry class, 1,000 millibar pressure is at the surface, and then you go all the way to like 200 pressure or something like maybe 50 pressure level, and that's like that's at the upper levels of the atmosphere, talking about bordering on space weather, like things where there's no atmosphere and you're at the surface and you have to worry about other things.
Right, so there's a concept of the 2D positioning, so somewhere on around the globe. Then there's the distance from the surface up. That's another aspect of these forecasts. Then there is at what point in time forward from the present. That's another aspect. And then you mentioned there's several other tens of parameters, that are forecast as well.
Right. Yeah, I think of meteorological variables, I think there might be like 5 that matter the most that you can derive everything else from, which might be like humidity or some sort of measure of the water content of the atmosphere, temperature, UV, wind position, or there's like a Fourier or like a transformation of that is used, for like, let's say like a calculus expression of it called divergence and vorticity. But you can roughly think of them as like the direction in which the wind is blowing in 3 orthogonal directions. And then, you have to forget, I think there's a few other ones that I'm forgetting right now. I just
needless to say, there's the speed of the wind as well.
From the speed of the wind in each direction of 3 orthogonal directions, you can calculate, you can derive the overall wind speed from that. It just is like, like a dot product or something like that.
Okay, and immediately getting into these physics-based models. Okay, and I should say, to motivate our attention here to all of these things that you're putting in front of us, Alex, we can think of right now the predicted path of Hurricane Melissa into Jamaica that's expected to make landfall something like today, being October 28th, 2025. Yeah, with possible significant destruction. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, so one thing I should probably state about how NWP works is that, I'll talk about this later in my slides, but this is a really expensive process. This takes tens of thousands of CPUs in supercomputers that really only exist at the level of like governments or big supercomputing facilities that people can rent. It requires to make a physical model, you kind of have to simulate every single intermediate step about what's happening on every level of the Earth, and often forward or backwards in time. That I guess that's the backdrop or setting, is that it takes like 6 hours to produce a 3-week forecast, and that matters really consequentially when you're talking about giving people the information they need to adapt to extreme weather events like hurricanes. And I want to say that as kind of like the setting of like how things generally have been until very recently, which I'll talk about in a second. About like, I think the reason why ML weather models are so exciting in particular is because it puts this really critical source of information, like the ability to know what's going to happen really soon in the context of a disaster, potentially into the hands of everyone. for everyone that has the capability to assemble them. And there's so much investment in it. The capability to make a weather forecast is getting cheaper and more accessible than ever. One thing I want to say about this slide before I continue, because I think this is a good transition to the topic at hand that I want to talk about, is what a reanalysis is, because this is really important as a backdrop for the machine learning portion. A reanalysis is an estimate, the best estimate we have of the ground truth, or like ground truth with air quotes, but it's a history of what the weather actually was going back a great distance in time. So the way a reanalysis is created is you take your previous forecast that you've made in the past, and then because you have the benefit of hindsight, you can measure what observations actually happened during those forecast times, and then you fix your prediction. And from fixing your prediction of what actually was observed versus your forecast, you could extrapolate to areas you didn't directly observe. And from a reanalysis, you can create a better initial state for future forecasts. So everything exists in this kind of self-referential process that leads to a virtuous cycle of trying to make the best estimate of like what actually did happen and what will happen.
Okay, so there's a continual learning process in these models.
Right, they are expensive, but they do a really good job, and they're understandable in the sense that we totally understand like classical physics, and therefore have a really good understanding and estimate of like what the weather actually was and what it really likely will be. The only problem is that it takes hours and hours and tons of compute, where you're in a setting where you have to trade off, am I going to predict this local area at a higher resolution and not have like as long of a forecast, or am I going to predict a long forecast and have a really coarse understanding of the world? Like, this grid is going to be, the cells will be bigger. We're going to cover larger areas of the Earth, a coarser measurement, but then maybe predict for farther. You have to make those trade-offs, because ultimately numerical weather prediction is bound or gated by the amount of compute you have that you can throw at it, not by the amount of data. I don't need to go into this too much. It's not totally important, but it's kind of relevant to what my work is currently. I just want to say that like in the in this physical process, underneath all these like analysis, reanalysis, and forecast, there are physics-based models. And what I just wanted to illustrate here is that to produce every step of this process, these are actually coupled models. So what people do is they make a model of the atmosphere, I think that's IFS, and then like the ocean sea ice, I think that's WAM, and then NEMO, which is a model of the ocean. And each of these models internally predict what they're really good at, like the primary qualities of the ocean, but then the certain aspects of what they're measuring, they feed into each other as something called forcings, or like they take what certain outputs of what they predict as inputs to another model, and they kind of self-referentially or recursively go forward to make the best estimate possible. So like NEMO needs to know what's happening at the very low levels of the ocean depths of like the temperature and pressure in there. And that's related to what's going on at the surface, or the sea surface temperature on its time scale that's appropriate. But the IFS, the atmospheric model, it only cares about what's happening at the sea surface temperature, and so on and so forth. And of course, eventually what's happening with the light from the sun, that's going to affect the sea surface temperature, and so on and so forth.
This really illustrates how difficult the challenge is. There's several essentially Earth or environmental systems that have to be modeled here, and that then helps understand why basically it's you need either 100 years ago 64,000 people or a data center in modern times. Yeah. I also wanted to say, in terms of the motivation, if you could just briefly go back to the previous slide. So we have another connection actually to another podcast guest, which came about through me being the MC for a tech workshop about risk and open data at New York Climate Week in the past month. So I had Arham Ansari, who's an engineer in India, who had sort of had a go as an amateur at weather forecasting and flood predictions, because, for example, in the past quarter, there's been more than 1,000 people in India who've lost their lives in floods. So I just want to say that as another, along with the current sort of Jamaica, the risk that Jamaica has in the track of in the path of Hurricane Melissa, it's a genuine issue a genuine risk to humanity. This is meaningful stuff, and there's lives that can be saved with these kind of predictions. But then that brings up also, and maybe this is getting off topic a bit, but nevertheless, it's all well and good to make these predictions, but then it's humanity's capacity to respond to what's predicted, and the resources they have to bring to bear on those emergency responses. But just for the sake of rounding out the picture there.
I think a lot about one article, if there's one that influenced kind of what I do for work or my career more than any, it was probably Brett Victor's article on what can a technologist do about climate change? And it's worrydream.co or .com/climate change is like the URL. Maybe we can add a link or something. Brett Victor, he was the one of the leaders of design at Apple for like many, many years. And now he does really cool like augmented reality stuff in the East Bay. But he says that policymakers have to make decisions, and it's kind of the role of a technologist or the engineers to give them more options through technology. And to make decisions that instead of making a really tough choice, like maybe there's a new capability that they didn't have before, like the idea that you've spoken about like Cambodia, and Cambodia, I've spent some time there, and it's a really powerful place. But Earth observation to find missing landmines, would be really incredible if the cost of that was like radically cheaper. Or in the context of weather, they're a really they're predicted one of the most intense drought-stricken regions of the world with a changing climate because of like where river flows are from, the south in Southeast Asia are going to be. So things like being able to the idea of like farmers in Phnom Penh or various parts of the rural Cambodia being able to put together weather forecasts to more accurately predict when rain is going to occur can like save on labor to help them plant crops way more efficiently to like hopefully these are like the math and stuff is really, really fun, and so is the computing, but like these are real things that affect real people in really significant ways.
Yeah, so in all of our hearts, it's those people that we would really hope would benefit from these sorts of advancements. And the message at a high level I'm hearing from you is that there's been some democratization as a result of the emergence of an AI or foundation model driven approach to this weather prediction. Okay, all right, I'm motivated.
Actually, speaking of my colleague Stefan Hoyer created a hybrid physics and AI based model that like saves a lot of this compute that I mentioned in this slide, and it recently has been used to help, it was an open source Creative Commons licensed model, and it recently has been deployed in India with partnership with UChicago to help predict like precipitation and various meteorological conditions for farmers in India, where they are a data limited country. Like they have far less radar stations than like other nations or other physical places on the earth, but we still can extrapolate and help your previous guest. There are like researchers, like the basic research is really leading to maybe materially better outcomes for people who really need this type of information, which is something that's incredibly exciting. And I like that anyone can make a try on a really low compute budget of just using a random forest and make a better than chance contribution. I think that's really fantastic, and goes to talk about the success of data science as a whole, where we have this, what Donahoe called frictionless reproducibility. That you're going to make me want to make a whole new slide deck, Will, and just talk about that.
No, it's so meaningful. It's wonderful, actually, to be able to extend these themes episode by episode, and just have you with your connections to MIT and Google expand on what this individual in North India in a village with 8 hours of power per day has started out on. So I just love the idea of the fact here that we're working on this episode by episode.
I appreciate your sense of gratitude and the kind of groundedness that you bring. I really admire that and your perspective as a host.